I'm here on behalf of Touched by Olivia Foundation. The Touched by Olivia Foundation, how do we get this started? The Touched by Olivia Foundation was started by an Australian couple who lost their daughter to cancer when she was 9 months old. The two objectives of the organisation was to find a cure for that particular cancer, which they did in 2010, and to provide an inclusive playground in every Australian community that required one. I'm a landscape architect. I'm a practitioner, not an academic, but just prior to them approaching me to design the first playground, I actually had a stroke. And the result of that stroke was that I found I had a lot of trouble in social situations. And when I Googled my symptoms, it actually diagnosed me as being classically autistic. So obviously I'm not, but that raised an interest for me in inclusive design, and my particular interest is in providing playgrounds that kids with ASD can actually engage in. So the Touched by Olivia Foundation believed that inclusive play is an important step in creating inclusive communities, and the reason for that is that research shows that usually by the age of 5, people have their biases embedded into their psyche, and so if kids are able to play side by side with each other and get used to the differences that these kids have, then they're going to be more integrated into the future. Inclusive playgrounds have exactly the same objectives as a traditional playground in that you have to provide access and engagement. So for an inclusive playground, access is not just a physical issue, it's also a social issue and an emotional issue. For social access, you're required to provide gathering spaces and spatial arrangement. And by spatial arrangement, we mean the juxtaposition of high activity areas with low activity areas. And this is important for kids who suffer from anxiety, and this is especially typical for ASD children, so that as they start to be overstimulated, they can move into a low activity area and control that anxiety. And emotional access requires the use of environmental cues so that children can use the messages that they get from objects and colours in the environment to know how to navigate and use a space, whereas neurotypicals tend to rely on social cues. ASD children obviously don't have the ability to identify and decode social cues, and so they use environmental cues in the space instead. So cueing can either be an object and its an arrangement in the space, or it can be a colour. The most obvious environmental cue is a path. People instinctively know that if they're on a path, the path will get them from A to B. For children with ASD, this is what adds the order and predictability into a space, and so it reduces the threat level. One of the things that I found when Google first diagnosed me was that most of the journal articles about autism suggested that the reason that autistic children had meltdowns was because of their reduced social skill set. They had trouble dealing with people. My experience was that I had trouble dealing with the spaces. It might have been the people that I reacted to, but it's the design of the space that actually starts that process of having a meltdown. And what I found was that spaces that I previously could go into, I couldn't go into anymore. And the reason that I found for that was because there was no predictability in the space, in that the neurotypicals were very random in how they moved through that space. And when I was tired, I couldn't read the social cues, and so I'd constantly run into people. After visiting a lot of special schools, I noticed that the autistic kids in one special school all moved in an anti-clockwise direction. So I immediately thought that autistic people always moved in an anti-clockwise direction. But what I realised from that was what they were doing was reading the messages that were in the space and following those messages. So they're very structured in how they move through a space, and so the space needs to give them the messages they need to know how to navigate it. And an environmental cue isn't a sign or an arrow, and the reason for that is that they're quite ambiguous, and whenever you have ambiguity within the space, then that can also lead to a meltdown. So that means that the design of the path has to be very particular. So the path has to be directional. You can't have intersections that are perpendicular, because a perpendicular arrangement means that you can either go left or right. So the paths need to merge. So that's what gives you the direction within that space. And if they don't have to make a decision within a space that they're already finding challenging because of the amount of people that are in it and the amount of sensory input that they're getting, then that helps them control their anxiety. You also need to, in the path, make sure that there's no service lids or drainage channels, because for some kids that will tip them over. And some of these things are for 0.001% of the community, but if you're going to make an inclusive space, then you have to obviously cater to everyone. Sorry, on the next page. So social access involves creating gathering spaces and the spatial arrangement, as I previously mentioned. With the gathering spaces, this relates to where you put it and the level of intimacy that you include in that space. So some people like to gather in large groups. Obviously, children with ASD are going to want to be in a smaller group, and they're more likely to want to be in a low activity area rather than a high activity area. So you need to provide multiple opportunities for how you're actually going to achieve that. Okay, I might just skip all that. So if you provide access alone, that is not an inclusive space. You need to provide some engagement as well. And this is an area where landscape architects tend to struggle, because they kind of get hung up on the problem that you can't get a kid in a wheelchair to the top of a 6-metre climbing frame. And I don't think that that's suggested as something that could be done, but what you need to do is provide for visual or verbal access, as was related in the last talk. So if you can't achieve physical access, you need to create spaces or curtilage around those activities or those playground items so that the kids can actually engage with each other verbally or visually. You also need to provide opportunities for intergenerational play. I think that if you include equipment in an inclusive play space that is specifically for disabled children, then that in itself is disabling. If you can provide intergenerational opportunities where the adults play with the children, then the adults are able to provide the physical or emotional support that some kids may need to actually play. But of course, intergenerational play is attractive to all kids, so that immediately removes that disabling factor from the piece of equipment. Graduating the physical and mental challenges allows you to cater to a much larger range of ability. And I'm getting booted already. So I think I'll just show some equipment here. The large image in the centre is an off-the-shelf piece which we modified the rear seat so that an adult could sit on it. And you can see from that image that the knees and the torso of the adult behind can provide that actual physical support that some kids don't actually have themselves. The buttons that are the middle right image are for the electronic merry-go-round, which is up the top there. Those buttons have been specifically designed to have no moving parts on them, so kids with even literally no motor skills can actually activate those buttons just using the electricity in their skin. And the sort of middle left area is what I referred to earlier as a low activity zone. You need to have these areas within the fence, and I firmly believe that you need to have a fence for the same reason that the last talk suggested that some ASD kids are runners. You need to have these low activity areas so that they've got a space to go to and reduce their anxiety levels. And here are some of the things that I always ask people to put in briefs for an inclusive play space. The first one is kind of obvious, I know, but it needs to be pointed out that what you're designing for is just needs. You're not designing for special needs. As soon as you turn them into special needs, then you're segregating those children from the main group, and that in itself means that the space isn't inclusive. The second point is my actual definition of inclusive playground design. And the reason I like these words is because it never mentions the word disabled. It refers to community, and that's actually what you're doing. You're not designing for inability, you're designing for ability. And also that the play space doesn't need to look any different than a traditional play space. What makes it unique is how the different users interpret the design interventions that you've put into it. For example, we see a footpath as a path. A kid with autism sees a footpath as a message or a rule or a regulation on the ground that gives them the control and the predictability over their environment to control their anxiety. So I think it's important to note that you just need to see how different elements can cater to different needs but still achieve the same outcome. Thanks.